Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss how valid the suggestions are that David Cameron is now the de facto Prime Minister, because it's not as ridiculous as it sounds. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So as this video goes out, it'll be Prime Minister's questions, but the big question is, who is the Prime Minister? There have been a number of commentators now saying that Cameron is basically Prime Minister in all but name. Now, you do sometimes get suggestions like this, you know, the power behind the throne type discussions, but in this case, there's quite a bit to it. First of all, I'd read somewhere, I think it must have been the Times or the Sunday Times at the weekend, can't find it now, but there was a suggestion that those close to Sunak were saying that Cameron had been brought in to handle foreign affairs so that Sunak could focus on the domestic agenda. Now, if true, that would already represent Rishi Sunak letting David Cameron have carte blanche over a whole raft of government policy. And although, yes, it is the case that Secretaries of State do determine policy for their departments, they don't have completely free rein to do so. First of all, I mean, the Prime Minister can overrule them at any time, but it has to be within the boundaries set by the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister is supposed to make sure that the government all pulls in the same direction. You can't have different government ministers, cabinet ministers, deciding antagonistic policies. There would be chaos. Mind you, Sunak has already shown that he's comfortable with chaos. Then we have the general alarm from some Tory MPs who are usually described as being on the right of the party. Now, at this point, it's worth pointing out how some common definitions are going to fail. As I've said, times before, when we're talking about right and left wing, strictly speaking, we're talking about economic policies. Both David Cameron and Rishi Sunak are both very far to the right, with Sunak much more to the right than most Tory MPs. But people often tie in social attitudes and describe authoritarian attitudes as far right. Now, neither Cameron nor Sunak are particularly driven by authoritarian attitudes, though they're not exactly champions of liberalism either. So when we say that the far right have a problem with David Cameron, we mean with regards his social attitudes rather than economic. Same with Rishi Sunak when it comes to it. But those on the right were worried that Cameron's inclusion in the cabinet might mean a further softening of Brexit attitudes. Sunak insisted that David Cameron was fully on board with the Brexit position established in the 2019 general election. Now, given that Rishi Sunak is not even aligned with that position anymore, this seems doubtful. So despite the words of comfort from a known liar, hardline Brexiteers are also worried about the head of the Remain campaign being in charge of foreign policy, particularly if Rishi Sunak is just letting Cameron loose and deciding whatever he wants. Then there was this from yesterday. Rishi Sunak was hosting the president of South Korea. And then he walked across Horse Guards Parade with his new Home Secretary, James Cleverly, and Foreign Secretary David Cameron. Now, the way this would normally be described in the papers, with the journalists using their tried and tested phrases, they would describe this gathering as Rishi Sunak flanked by Cleverly and Cameron. But this was not the case. It was such a mess that even the GB News gobshites noticed it. David Cameron was in the middle, with Sunak on his right flank. Now, if you didn't know the members of the British government and you were told, oh, this is the British Prime Minister walking with his two senior members of the cabinet, you would think David Cameron was the Prime Minister there. He's the one in the middle. And I'm at a loss to explain what happened here. Things like this are very carefully choreographed, by the team around the Prime Minister. When heads of government meet, there's always a lot of attention paid to how the pictures will look in the media. Everything is arranged down to the finest detail, all works out in advance. So was this another example of Sunak simply not having the right team around him? Is it just that he simply doesn't have people handling the PR of his public appearances, as literally every head of government in the world has? Or was this Sunak subconsciously defaulting to the position of subordinate to Cameron because it's how he feels? After all, Sunak has Cameron to thank for his current position, not just because Sunak won his seat in 2015 when Cameron was leader, but because he'd made a real push to get more ethnic diversity into the Conservative Parliamentary Party. So just as some of the 2019 MPs are ultra loyal to Johnson because they have him to thank for their seats. So too, a lot of Tory MPs have that same loyalty to Cameron, including Sunak. And you look at this image, and Sunak is definitely feeling subordinate. What's not clear in my mind is the explanation. Did it all just happen naturally? You know, no discussion about it. That's just how they naturally organise themselves. In which case, you would still say that it shows that Cameron is going to hold a lot of sway over Sunak in cabinet or private discussions. It shows that Cameron's going to say, oh, Rishi, we should do this thing. And Rishi will go, oh, good idea, mate. We'll do that. At which point, Cameron is effectively like the Prime Minister. Or is it an explicit arrangement? Has Sunak basically told Cameron, even though he hasn't shared it around, that he wants him to lead on a lot of government policies so that he can focus on the very few which are important to him? And the ones that are important to Sunak are, of course, keeping the rebellion in his party from becoming large enough to oust him and pursuing whatever deals he's working on in order to guarantee that he and his wife become much richer once he leaves office. Probably the India trade deal. Then we had this from Zach Goldsmith, suggesting that a Sunak supporter had told him that they expected Sunak to grow into the job, but he hasn't. Now, bear in mind, Goldsmith is not a fan of Sunak. He's a strong Johnson loyalist and has attacked Sunak in the past. But what is undeniable is that a lot of Tory MPs thought that Sunak would actually make a good leader. Now, I said at the time, a year ago, I could see how they would adopt him as the least bad option. I could absolutely see that he would be the right choice for them in terms of like compared to the others. But they were deluding themselves if they thought he would turn the party fortunes around. At best, he would narrow the polls a bit to the point where they looked vaguely respectable. Granted, I didn't realise he would turn out to be quite so hopelessly bad as he is. But that's because I thought he'd at least get good advisors around him. But a year ago, you really got the impression that a lot of Tory MPs felt that with Sunak in place, they could finally get back to the serious business of government. Only the most blinkered MPs could possibly still think that. So despite Goldsmith possibly having an axe to grind in what he says, what he's saying does tie with what the impression we're getting. Then there's the fact that Sunak is incredibly weak. Now, how many times when leadership has been called for has he run away, frankly? He backed down on housing targets. Yes, there was talk of a rebellion defeating him in a vote, and you don't want to lose a vote. But this was a manifesto promise. All of his MPs had committed to backing it because it was the manifesto promise. And it was a Boris Johnson manifesto promise. He could have used that as an early opportunity to put his foot down, to show some political acumen. Failed. Then he failed to discipline those attacking the Privileges Committee. This was an easier test, which he also failed. He was so weak, he even ran away from Parliament when the findings were being debated, leaving Penny Mordaunt to look like the party leader. Every time Sunak has been required to show leadership, he has backed down. So it's not easy to dismiss the notion that he would, of course, defer to his former boss. Then there's the reason why Sunak is Prime Minister in the first place. Now, I think it's increasingly obvious he has no political aims. Like, what is Sunakism? I mean, no one's even used the word Sunakism, has it? Because you can't. Like, what is it? What is it? What's his political philosophy? Like, Boris Johnson didn't really have one either. Although you got the impression he did want to leave his mark in some way. He wanted to leave government with a thing that he could say, I did that. He just lacks the focus to throw his weight behind any project to actually get it done. So nothing happened. But Sunak doesn't even have that project. With every policy, it's really about doing what's necessary to keep his government together until he wants to call the election. You know, in one of his Meet the PM events earlier this year, he admitted to not really knowing anything about politics until he became an MP. Frankly, he hasn't learned very much since. But it's an admission that he didn't enter Parliament to achieve political goals. Some people enter Parliament because, you know, they've got political ideas and they want to see them realised. That's the case surely with most MPs. But not Sunak, by his own admission. So why did he choose to become an MP? To make his family even richer. When you look at what he spends his time pursuing, like really pursuing, it's budgets and deals which benefit his family business interests. Interests which he is in the habit of not even declaring at times. I am 95% sure that Sunak is only focused on feathering his nest. That if he had the trade deal, the India trade deal all sewn up, it was all ratified, I think he'd have already called the general election because I don't think he can be asked with all this. I think he just wants to get his ducks in a line. He might not even mind being deposed in the new year if he can be sure that his replacement drives the India trade deal home before the election. And if that is his only purpose for climbing the greasy pole of politics, then it is easy to see how he views all policies in terms of either those that can help him get richer, or his wife get rich, his household, should we say, and those which only exist to keep his MPs from open mutiny. And if so, you can also see how he'd be more than happy to leave the second of those types of policy to Cameron. You know, maybe Cameron is the de facto Prime Minister, not because of any explicit arrangement, but just because Cameron will naturally have opinions on government policies and Sunak doesn't give a shit unless he can make money out of it. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.